Today I'm tackling procrastination, why we do it, and how to claim back your focus. Now, if you're really interested to be a peak performer, you can't get there unless you're actually doing your most important task, which is right in front of you. Welcome back to Peak Performance Hacks, and I'm your host, Doctor Gan. As a practicing physician, I can tell you that I've spent most of my early life trying to avoid procrastination. For everyone, this can be different, but personally, for me, the reason why I procrastinated is because one, the activity itself may be too challenging or perceived to be too challenging, or two, it could be the fact that it would take me a longer time and I just think it's quite boring. Now, there are many reasons why people procrastinate, but these are some of the reasons that I've come up with, which I personally feel is the reason why people procrastinate. The first one would be, in a simple word, instant gratification. Now, doing a task that is challenging and you feel is quite difficult puts us in a position where we feel like we're not actually moving forward and we're not actually taking action to get there. Doing a simpler task that doesn't take up a lot of energy and that you can do really quickly gives you that instant dopamine hit, like you feel that you've actually done something. And so the more challenging tasks, which are often quite important, are usually the ones that you should be focusing on, but the ones that you put aside and you procrastinate to do. Now, the second reason would be that it makes us feel better about ourselves. Now, I'm a person who has a lot of to-do lists. I have checklists. I have little paper sheets where I write things that I need to do. And I can tell you that ticking them off once it's done feels good. But the issue there is that just ticking off a task that's not important feels good, but really doesn't really move the needle to where I need to be going. And for that reason, many people procrastinate because by just feeling like you're busy and that you're actually doing something can often trigger that feeling that you're moving or you're taking steps towards where you want to go. But if you actually audit your task list or your to-do list, you'll find that most of those activities are quite menial and they're not that important. The third reason would be we are avoiding the task altogether. Now, when it's challenging, it takes too long, or you just feel it's boring, it's often easier to push it aside and focus on other tasks. Unfortunately, the effect of not doing that task, especially if it's important, will compound. And a very good example of this is exercise. For many people, they don't enjoy exercising. For me, I do, but when I'm doing a very difficult workout, I often regret it in that moment, thinking, why did I decide to do this? But the reality is, if you missed one day, you may not see a huge difference. You miss a week, again, you might come up with excuses why you didn't do it. But if you start missing a month to 2 months, that's when it compounds and you start to see the effects, whether your health goes down, your joints start aching, and you just don't feel good anymore. And again, this is the reason why people push it aside. And finally, it's the dopamine effect. Now, when you do something and you complete it, you immediately get excited by that fact that you've completed that task. Now, when you're doing a task that is challenging or takes time, or sometimes is a little bit boring, you may find yourself wanting to look at other things, whether it be social media or Netflix or every other distraction that's out there that's a lot more fun than the task that you're actually doing right in front of you. And personally, I feel these are the common reasons why most people procrastinate. Now, if you can come up with a better reason, please leave a comment below because there are tons of reasons or even excuses that people do come up with, and I'd like to know some of it, especially from some of our viewers out there. So what is the problem with procrastination? Now, you're not really hurting anyone and you're just not doing an activity. Well, just because you're doing something does not mean that it's actually worth doing. Now, many people live in this paradigm whereby they're just being busy. They're running around, they're doing a lot of activities. It almost appears that they do not have time for anything else because they're being busy. And I've heard it a lot before, and potentially I've even done it myself where I've acted in that manner because when you're busy being busy, you almost feel like you're important and you then forego the important tasks that you should be doing. When you look at the Pareto principle, which is the 80-20 principle, one way to look at it and an example would be in a business perspective would be 80% of your revenue is coming from 20% of your clients. Now, the smart thing to do would be to be focusing on those 20% that is getting you 80% of your results rather than spending 80% of your time only getting 20% of your results. So you can understand how this principle would work for most of the things you do. Another very important point when we procrastinate is that if we're not actually taking action, you're not going to get to the tasks or get to the outcomes that you want because you're just not doing anything about it. It's very easy when you're procrastinating to get into this analysis paralysis state whereby you're only thinking about doing an activity, but you actually don't go ahead and do it. A very simple example would be just thinking about doing something never gets you anywhere. It'll be like thinking about doing push-ups to get fitter, but never actually getting fitter. Now, what can you do if you've been a chronic procrastinator for years? And these are some of the tips or strategies that I've felt has helped me the most. The first and most important thing is that you have to be straight up with yourself and you have to look yourself in the mirror and ask yourself, what are you actually avoiding? Now, most of us procrastinate, as I mentioned, because we're trying to avoid something that is either challenging, takes up time, or maybe something that scares us. Now, we could be afraid of something, or there could be fear involved here. Maybe the fear of not being good enough, maybe the fear that it's too difficult, maybe the fear that you think you're not smart enough to do it, maybe even the fear that if you did achieve it, what are the consequences that may come afterwards? And these are some of the reasons why we procrastinate, because we're pushing away something. Now, for most people, they're either moving towards something or they're moving away from something. And when we procrastinate, we're actually trying to move away from something. So you have to be honest with yourself and find out exactly what you're actually scared of or afraid of. And people don't like that word of fear and being afraid, but it's something that we all feel. And it's actually important that you be honest with yourself and recognize that there could be fear behind this. The next would be prioritizing the most important task. Now, it's simpler said than done because when you sit down and you start writing out your tasks, you might think that every task there is important. I would implore you to sit down and write down all the tasks that you have and then put an asterisk on the most important task that will move the needle. Now, one way to do it is that if you did not do this task, what would be the consequence in a month, in 3 months, in 6 months, or in a year? Now, not doing that task, and especially if it was an important task, would make a huge difference in your life in a month, 3 months, 6 months, and even a year. So prioritize the most important tasks. And another thing that I do that generally helps me when I'm trying to prioritize tasks is that I look at my task and I look at it from an 80-20 principle. What is the 20% of tasks that I have in front of me that would make 80% of the other tasks just redundant? So I focus on those 20% of tasks that would make the biggest difference and then let go of the 80% which probably aren't that important. Now, I'm not saying you don't get it done, but it's something that can be pushed on the back burner that's not going to make a huge difference. Next, you may have heard of Eat That Frog. Now, this was popularized by Mark Twain when he said, get up in the morning and do the most difficult tasks. And Brian Tracy, who is a productivity expert and a trainer in time management, he wrote a book talking about Eat That Frog, whereby you do the most or the hardest thing that you can do first thing in the morning. Now, for many people who don't enjoy exercise, this is why they exercise in the morning, because they feel that as the day goes on, their ability to do hard tasks reduces as your energy goes down and as you feel a lot more tired. So waking up in the morning and doing the hardest task first is probably the best thing you can do to avoid procrastination. Now, you've already worked out which is the most important task, and now all you have to do is just start by doing it first thing in the morning. Next, we have time blocking. Now, time blocking is very important because, as I mentioned, part of the reason we procrastinate is because we get distracted by the dopamine hits we get when we look at our phone or we watch TV. Now, by time blocking yourself and putting it in your calendar, then this way you know the most important tasks are getting tackled that week. So no matter what happens in your to-do list that never gets ticked off, if you get the most important task, this will move you forward. Now, one thing I do is that if it's not on my calendar, it never happens. And so I often put the most important tasks in my calendar and I ensure that I get this done. I'm so bad to the point that if I didn't actually write something because I forgot to put something in my calendar, I would almost just leave it as time for myself and not do anything else. Now, it's not a bad thing because it allows myself to relax in those moments, but I'm actually focused on my calendar so much that if it's not there, it doesn't happen. Now, using apps can help because a lot of us work on computers and it's easy to do a little bit of research and click on a video or even browse the internet on activities in the pretense that we're actually doing research. And so having apps that basically block out all your programs and only have certain programs open is one way of time blocking. Next, I would change your perspective. Most procrastinated work is either overwhelming or sometimes underwhelming and takes too much time and just feels boring. Now, one way to get past this, and it's a little cheat that I use, is that by you not doing that activity, it's actually costing you more than you think. Now, obviously, if you can outsource this and you can delegate it to someone else, this would end up being a win-win for everyone. But most of the time, if it's an important task, it's something that you personally probably have to do. And in that same token, by telling yourself, what are you losing by not doing this? That actually hurts a lot more than actually focusing on how boring this activity is. Because by you not doing this, this is going to change the outcome of what is going to happen in the next month, the next 3 months, the next 6 months, and even the next year. And so having that change of perspective and that change of language when you talk to yourself on what is most important to do can make a huge difference. Now, the last technique that really helps is breaking a larger task into smaller tasks. One way of thinking about it is chunking down. Now, if you had a large task that seemed boring or seemed like a lot of work, you may not want to do it. But by chunking it down into smaller pieces and getting really detailed and granular about these smaller pieces, it will make it a lot more easier for you to complete this task. Now, initially, you may think that it is a lot of work to do it this way, but the reality is once you break it into smaller tasks that maybe takes you a shorter amount of time to do, you will have the momentum and the progress of actually getting your task completed. Now, there was a French artist that actually ate an entire plane, and I'm not kidding when I say this. He ingested an entire plane by breaking it into small pieces and ingesting it daily, and he did it over 2 years. Now, I'm not recommending that you actually do something like this, and I'm not quite sure what his health is right now. But the reality is by breaking into smaller pieces, and even if it took you 5 minutes a day to do that, you will still feel that you're making progress and momentum. For many, you might think that blocking out a period of 2 hours is better than doing a 5 minute task. And it really doesn't matter, but speed doesn't matter when you're trying to get the most important task out of the way. Now, if it only takes you 5 minutes, I would do it immediately rather than waiting to do this activity. But as long as you're getting the hardest thing done, which is the most important task ahead. Now, being someone who's procrastinated for a very long period in my life, I've not completely overcome it. And every time I come across a time where I'm actually procrastinating, I go through these techniques to ensure that I'm actually staying focused on what is most important. With all of us, we're only human, and you'll go through periods where you procrastinate. And my suggestion here would be to be kind to yourself and to be resourceful, because when you go through periods where you're not actually making any movement or momentum, it's easy for you to be hard on yourself and think, why are you not focused enough to do the most important tasks? And it's times like that that I would remind you that the answer is often right in front of you. And if you focused on that, you'll end up doing the most important task. Now, I hope this helps. And until I see you again, speak soon. This wraps up this episode of Peak Performance Hacks. All the links and resources are in the video description or in the resource section, whether it is on Spotify or Apple Podcasts. If you're watching this on YouTube, please consider subscribing. And if you're listening on Apple Podcasts or Spotify, please leave us a review so that more people can discover our podcast and it could benefit them as well. Until I catch you next time, speak soon.